4. It was a tedious bond of blood that kept him indoors for the rest of the day. He hovered uncomfortably in the kitchen or clopped unostentatiously through the corridors on the off chance that Julius might want to unburden himself in some unimaginable departure from precedent. There was also, Hallam could more readily admit, morbid curiosity to remember his father in a similar state. Hallam had to scroll back several years to his mother's funeral at a great little crematorium on a blustery spring day. Even the some expression of Julian's emotions during the brief service had been one sharp expulsion of snot into a large handkerchief. Hallam remembered very little of the day, even though he had been sensitive to the eyes of a fellow observer in the form of an egg-shaped stranger in a black mackintosh who stood back discreetly as they filed out towards the grubby ornamental garden. Now, like then, Hallam felt somehow responsible for his father's suffering. After Nicola had made a tearful early departure following some persistent and uncharacteristic bullying from Julius, Hallam set about preparing overcooked pasta, accompanied by a neatly divided pork pie on the side. The 2 placemats set on the kitchen table had an inevitable poignancy which Hallam was agonizingly sensitive to as he walked in ahead of his father. He feared it might provoke Julius, but instead he merely looked at the food without interest and then lit a cigar and wandered dreamily down to the lawns, leaving Hallam to eat alone. If nothing else, the dreary afternoon and evening made Hallam feel that he had done his duty. The next morning Julius threw himself into his work as usual, and only emerged to disappear for a meeting. Hallam made his way back up to the lake. He had barely glimpsed the water through the foliage before he sensed something was wrong. It might have been a different note in the calls of the birds. With shadows or disturbances in the grass, it seemed clumsily human. That was the way he cast his eyes with special care along the lakeside and found evidence of an incursion, a crushed beer can, half hidden behind a hanging shrub. On closer inspection of the long grass, he found confirmation, cigarette butts, and 3 or more crushed cans of tiger bitter. Poachers, he thought, although it must have been years since villagers had bothered to come up here and cast a line into the torpid waters, the trout having been missing and presumed dead for as long as he could remember. He gathered the trash up in a heap and was preparing to head down the slope toward the dustbins when the possibility of something far worse occurred to him. He turned and ran to the oak tree, sprang onto the rope ladder, and clambered up to center point. He hadn't even reached the top before he saw the covering of lurid spray paint graffiti. The most striking message was in dark red capitals across the front door. Pervert. With shaking hands he checked the padlock. It was intact, as was the door, but the splinters testified that there had been an attempt to force entry, probably by kicking. He silently blessed his father's neurotic insistence on quality materials when he had nailed center point together during the early days of his partnership building in the trees when business was thin on the ground. Hallam rapidly drew up the rope ladder behind him and inspected the damage circling the roof to read the abuse in vivid colors which wrapped all 4 sides of the cabin. Peeping was scrawled in big letters on one wall, with the G squashed up. Tom Bent had been attempted with some difficulty on the far side. It must have been sprayed from above, and Snob Monkey Wanker on the next in smaller text. Finally, Hallam looked under his hands and knees at the most intriguing honorary title of them all, sprayed diagonally on the roof in green. Hallam wondered whether this was a condensation of 2 insults, or a simple misspelling. Either way, that was one which stuck in his mind. Indeed. He turned the key in the padlock with some difficulty, opened the sliding door, excising the E, then R, then V to leave pert. He bent down and crawled through the word into the dark interior, with the window slats pushed aside to allow the light in. Hallam could breathe properly again. One of the slats was battered, but it withstood the assault. At the price of some cracks and scrapes, everything was undisturbed. The string hammock was draped on a hook in the corner as before, and his logbooks, telescope, and beautiful new binoculars were still snug in the chest. He sat down cross-legged and giddily imagined the horror that might have been. A break-in. The logbooks. He did not want to contemplate the consequences had they been stolen, with all the records they contained of the movements, al fresco sexual encounters, and other observed or eavesdropped privacies that he had gathered over the past 4 years from various corners of the grounds, village gardens, hedgerows, and the church cemetery. This had to be the result of the Ginny episode, her brother perhaps. He would have to take extra care from now on. He passed the rest of the morning cleaning up Center Point, working fast in case Carl should see what happened. Initially he tried to sandpaper off the insults, but all it did was leave plainly legible shadows on the words in the old wood, so he settled instead on painting over them in blotches of dark green, which had the added advantage of camouflaging the treehouse. But he realized that this place was no longer secure. He returned to the paint pots to the workshop and moved his logbooks to his bedroom. He spent the rest of the day in an oak tree, dozing through the heat, and he'd been bedded down there for most of the night, and he knew Julius was unlikely to notice, let alone care. It was a pleasure listening to the owls and occasional badger movements below as the stars came out. He saw no further sign of intruders, only distant voices of returning pub-goers. The long, thin carving knife he had procured for the kitchen, feeling slightly foolish and subsequently strapped to his leg, remained unused, but it did confer a kind of ceremonial legitimacy to his watch. The following morning he was positioned by a small arched window in the stable loft when he spotted his father emerge from the back door and disappear down one of the paths that ran past the church. Hallam decided to make a covert pursuit. A quick can of the ornamental pond at the bottom of the leaves indicated that Julius had not taken an indirect route to his favorite smoking spot, so Hallam followed a hunch and made his way cautiously down the path towards the gate that opened into the churchyard. He opened the little iron gate, overgrown with ivy, as quietly as he could, and trotted down the stepping-stone path round to the church entrance. Inside the church was cool and empty, the pews bare. He glanced over towards the occupants of a previous hall destroyed by fire. They were laid out in their tombs, shrimp-sized, in full medieval regalia. At their feet were what looked like Masonic symbols. Hallam went to the back of the church and stepped round the hanging bell ropes. He climbed a metal ladder attached to the wall at the back and emerged through a trapdoor and into the bell chamber. He squeezed through the window and pulled himself up over the crenellated wall at the top of the tower, where he found himself on the ledge beside the stump of the spire. The lead roofing was warm under his hands. He crawled round the stump with its absurd weather vane, keeping his head down, and passed one of 4 badly eroded gargoyles, whose secular purpose was to spew rainwater. Squeezing up beside a heavily eyebrowed griffin with a stone beak, he spotted his father on the far side of the churchyard, puffing on a mantilla. Julius skirted the old gravestones, pretending to read their barely decipherable inscriptions, but hovered near the family plot all the while, where the church authorities had generously allowed a small plaque to be placed in memory of his wife. Hallam knew that Julius would be understandably paranoid about visiting her memorial for fear that somehow the information might get back to Verity. Hallam was not the only spy in the village. He watched his father for some time, but learnt nothing. Only when a person under observation felt entirely secure in their privacy did Hallam feel that he could again gain furtive access to what lay at their center. Julius was too self-conscious for that. Hallam sighed. If he could not burgle intimacy from his father, he would be forced to try a more conventional approach. Hallam was back in the grounds and sitting on the bench by the hedge when he heard the gate squeak and approaching footsteps for Julius. Hallam pretended to be a little surprised when he came into full sight. "Oh, hi!" Julius seemed distantly to detect his son's presence in front of him. "Hallam, what are you up to?" "Not much, Hugh." "Not much either." Julius started to walk away. "Where's Verity gone?" Hallam asked, more stridently than he intended. Her absence had not yet been remarked upon by either of them. Julius paused but kept his back to his son. "She's away for a few days. Nothing to worry about." He walked back to his office. Later, Julius went into the kitchen and found Hallam making a sandwich. Hallam, as usual, felt vaguely guilty about being there. "Hallam, I was just wondering." Julius paused and looked pained. He jingled the absent change in his pockets, then fixed Hallam with an earnest gaze. "Would you like a driving lesson?" Hallam's mouth dropped. He shuddered again. An unwelcome rite of passage was being forced upon him. What did cars have to do with him? "Why? No, I don't think so," he blurted. Panic fluttered between them. "I didn't know you let anyone drive your car," he added. "I don't." Julian was crestfallen. "Besides, I don't have a provisional license." Julius's eyes lit up with hope, and he pointed at the binoculars which were hanging around Hallam's neck. "Why don't we go bird-watching?" That was when it dawned on Hallam. "Is this an attempt at bonding?" Julius scratched the back of his neck and flushed slightly. Hallam had patronized his father for the first time. It felt like a significant moment. Julius let out a long sigh of admission, and embarrassment began to lift. "Yes," he confessed, "I suppose it is." "Okay, let's take a drive." "We don't have to go on the road." Father and son sat side by side in front of the dark blue Jaguar. Despite his good intentions, Julius was proving to be an outstandingly bad teacher. Hallam's hands hung self-consciously from the steering wheel at 10 to 2 as recommended by the Highway Code Manual, while Julius testily explained the controls, addressing him like a moron. You'll remember the pedal on your left is the brake. That's the most important one. If you're worried that you're out of control, that's the one to hit. Don't worry about the rest, okay? Okay, so step on it. Cool. Hallam reached for the ignition. No, step on the brake. Hallam sighed and did so. Good. Now do you want to go through the rest again? I wouldn't mind turning on the engine if that's all right with you. Only good time. Now don't forget what I told you about the automatic. I've driven the tractor. I think I can handle it. At this point, Carl walked past them carrying a petrol can. He stopped to stare brilliantly at this unusual sight. Before gathering himself together and continuing on his way, Hallam decided to ambush Julius. Did you and Verity fall out for some reason? Not that I know of. Now turn the key to the right and start the ignition. I got the feeling that something was going on. Just pay attention to what you're doing, Julius snapped. Hurry up, I've got a meeting in 20 minutes. Who with? Concentrate on what you're doing. Hallam grunted. He wanted to know what Julius was cooking up, but his father was obsessive about security and the office was always locked if he went out. He started the engine. Then, without waiting for instructions, he let off the handbrake and shoved the gear lever into drive, pressing on the accelerator as he did so. The big car plunged forward. Julius screamed, "Wait!" Startled, Hallam had to drag the steering wheel left to take it onto the main drive, but he oversteered, aiming the car instead towards a low stone mushroom. "Stop!" shouted Julius, groping for the handbrake. Hallam attempted to stamp both feet on the brake, but he caught the accelerator as well, and the bonnet reared up to the sound of the screeching metal. That evening, Hallam kept himself hidden in Center Point and dwelled gloomily on his situation and the seemingly intractable failings of his personality, to which the only reliable solution, so Verity had seemed to suggest on their walk up the drive, was suicide. His contemplation of his self-slaughter lacked serious conviction, but out of the reckless spiritual curiosity particular to his age group he had earlier in the day, climbed out onto the roof and tested the strong breeze, stepping right up to the edge and leaning frantically beyond what was safe, just to experience how it might feel out there on the margins, but the wind had pushed him back like an unappetizing meal. What was more, the prospect of a violent impact just hadn't seemed that appealing. His initial refusal to kill himself was not, of course, definitive. He wondered if momentary madness required mental preparation, but he did not think that he was mad or even vaguely capable of what was called an episode in the loathsome quack talk of the psychiatrists and other buffoons who failed to help his mother. Still, there was always the possibility that Verity was partly right and that he had inherited some strand of instability. It was perhaps even likely that he would grow into a dangerous pervert, at the very least. Then who knew what expression the bad seed would find for itself. For now, however, he decided that suicide was not on the agenda, and he turned his mind to the more bracing fantasy of Verity and Julius's accidental death. He got as far as choosing the coffins, pale pine he thought, in consideration of the rainforest, before his pleasure was destroyed by the suspicion that, as fantasies went, parental death was actually rather pedestrian, adolescent even. Perversion, he resolved, would henceforth be a point of pride. He determined to be exacting in its cultivation. It held a promise of originality. His mood lifted and he stretched with satisfaction. Whatever traumas his father was going through, Verity's absence was a boon for him. His mind had cleared. Perhaps if he understood himself better, then he would find a way ahead in his life. He considered the lake below and strove to understand the reverence it inspired him. Its construction, he saw now, had been a labor of hope. In the face of extermination from plague, the villagers had tried something to save themselves, a futile attempt as it turned out, and the act of desperation, but the digging had served a purpose, and not just to give the ruling aristocracy a semblance of control in helpless circumstances. Their suffering and hope had created something beautiful that would endure. It had become somewhere to commune with the past. It was a genuine memorial, not a dumpy, pompous block of stone with soldiers' names on it, like in a churchyard beyond, or a weather-smudged plaque in a family plot. Perhaps the lake offered hope to him, too. It had already offered him a memory of his mother. With obsessive repetition, he had revisited every image and sensation associated with it, the smell of his mother's perfume, the water's slap on the hull, to the point that he feared that overuse might warp the memory somehow. He wanted more of his past back, but he was unable to summon it on his own. What had he done with it? Tonight, though, he felt as if contact might be possible. The night was cool, and it had been with his mother. The moon was just as high, if not, this time, so full. Hallam took up his badger pelt and the cigar box and made his way down the rope ladder. He walked to the side of the lake and took off his clothes. He tied the pelt round his head. He applied some of his mother's old makeup, the lipstick around his mouth this time, the foundation across his chest as well as his cheeks. He was familiar with the sensations of the lake now, and he moved with greater ease into the water, the whiteness of the foundation on his skin echoing the shuttered reflection of the moon. It got chilly. He let himself float on his back. He tried this with his eyes closed and then open. He tried to think of some appropriate incantation that might cause something to happen, but his feeble attempts sounded absurd. Our Father, art he in heaven? I don't think so. He discovered how little spiritual equipment the modern world possessed. No more jujus or prayers. He began to accept as the cold numbed his feet and hands, and he was not going to be transported in any way whatsoever, and that she wasn't there. This had been a mistake. Hallam was wading back to the grassy bank, thinking of hot tea when he heard the crack of a branch and the twang of a fence wire being jumped over. By the time he had pulled himself out of the lake, the dark figure that he might or might not have seen was away over the fields. The clouds did not help him pick out which way they were going. Hallam stood there, exposed and helpless, one hand cupping his. He peeled a strip of rotten weed off his thigh. There was nothing he could do, so, rubbing his meatless ribcage to restore some circulation, Hallam went to find his clothes. The silver BMW scraped to a halt in the pebbles in the late morning. Verity emerged and took some supermarket shopping bags out of the boot. As if she had only popped into town for a couple of hours, Julius was undignified in his rejoicing. He rushed out of the back door, and they hugged and laughed and immediately went up to their bedroom where Hallam saw them, through the binoculars from the southwest traverse, pinballing around the room and attempting to undress without interrupting their passionate kissing. Hallam caught a brief flash of his father's white as he pressed bodily against the window pane before he quickly turned away appalled and concentrated instead on the more wholesome sight of the kitchen's beagle Raymond crapping on the front lawn, its actions no doubt heartily endorsed by the owners. Hallam was not pleased to see Verity again, but when he came in that evening, after giving the reunited couple sufficient time to rut themselves to exhaustion, he was greeted with smiles of forgiveness, even with certain reservations from Julius. Verity kissed Hallam with moist sincerity, declared, "Let's open a bottle of some good stuff," and Julius hummed his way down the cellar steps, exhibiting a shamelessly post-coital bounce as he went. Hallam decided to go with the blow. Open hostility with a drag, compared to superficial reconciliation. And vintage champagne would certainly help ease away the compromise that seemed to coat his gullet. They were eating supper in the dining room, and Hallam had taken a mouthful of peas when Julius made his announcement about the plans for developing the lake. Hallam's intake of breath caused one of the peas to attempt entry into his lungs, and his coughing fit prevented Julius for a moment from presenting the details. When Hallam had finally sputtered into a wet-eyed conclusion, Julius impatiently sought permission to go out and received a stunned nod of assent. Verity caught Hallam's attention with a smile and discreetly tapped her chin, mouthing the word drool. Hallam wiped the spittle with his napkin and dropped his eyes apologetically. "The plan," Julius started, "is to transform the wasteland around the lakeland and turn it into an ultra-modern residential development. In short, bungalows." "Bungalows?" gasped Hallam weakly, failing utterly to disguise his horror. "Not bungalows the way you're thinking," laughed Julius with the hearty enthusiasm he reserved for work alone. "They'll all be underground. Let me show you." He reached round to the serving table and unrolled a large plan of the lake area. "Julius, can't this wait until we finished eating?" asked Verity tiredly. "Come on, it was your idea in the first place." "Underground bungalows," said Hallam, staring but not assimilating the plan spread out over the table's polished mahogany. Julius began to explain. "Now, if you see here, the new village will take the form of a hexagon. We'll plant saplings along here, and where the main lake is now, we'll have a long, gentle stretch of lawn for recreational uses. It will be an environmental village, partly submerged to preserve the heat and maintain the unspoilt appearance of the area. We'll have all the latest techniques for supplementing conventional energy supplies and computers, too." "Where are the lakes on this plan?" asked Hallam. "They will be filled in," answered Julius briskly. You've seen for yourself, Hallam, that they're stagnant and on the point of collapsing at health risk. Young families with kids won't want it. Hallam saw the plans for what they were, a map of desecration. You can't do it, he said simply. Yes, we can, replied Julius. What's more, it will help you pay through a university, not mention the other improvements in the grounds. There's no point being sentimental. Sentimental? Verity sounded amazed. How can either of you feel sentimental about the lake? Do we want anyone else drowning in there? I take it one was enough, snapped Hallam. There was one short of silence, and Verity looked down demurely at her plate. Hallam could see she was gaining in confidence. Once just a mention of death was avoided. Now, short of explicit reference to suicide, the tide mark of acceptability was creeping forwards. Julius looked startled. Filling them in won't make any difference, said Hallam quietly. Julius breezed on. I'm glad we've agreed then. The oak will have to go too, of course, and a couple of other trees with it, and that, I am afraid, will include the treehouse. Still, you're growing out of that now anyway, aren't you, Hallam? Graduated to wrecking cars? Hallam blinked stupidly. He knew he was helpless. The trees? Julius sighed, scratching his head. Although there might be ways around that, temporarily. Verity straightened up. Surely, Julius, you're not going to risk the oak falling down and flattening someone. It wouldn't be professional. You heard what tree surgeon said. Either it's coming down in a controlled way, or one day it will just keel over. Julius grunted and wrapped up his plans with a scowl, annoyed that his enthusiasm for a project had not met with the unanimous rapture that he was hoping for. You're probably right, but Hallam does spend half his life up there doing his, he paused diplomatically, bird watching. Well, once the oak tree is down, I think it will be a brilliant sight, said Verity. I'm sure Mr. Shaney will be pleased. Overgrown land harbors all sorts of vermin, doesn't it? We won't risk publicity until we've got the project through the planning application, so keep it quiet. Verity filled her wine glass, and Julia went back to eating the roast pork. Hallam felt sick. He excused himself and went upstairs to his bedroom. His logbooks had gone missing. The phone call came the next day. Nicola picked it up, and after a brief panicked discussion while the journalist waited on the line, Julius decided to take it with the full intention of putting the man off. In fact, he said slightly more than he intended because he was vaguely familiar with the journalist, and he found himself letting off steam while he tried to persuade the journalist to tell him how many had come by the plans for the development, but the journalist was unable to say. The rest of the day was chaotic. There were manic phone calls downstairs as Julius tried to establish who might have leaked the story. Upstairs, Hallam ransacked his room for the missing logbooks, which he could only conclude after 3 ruthless searches had been taken from where he was certain he had left them, at the back of the cupboard. He sat down in his bed, surrounded by upturned drawers and scattered clothing and papers. He decided against confronting Verity and demanding his property back, mainly because he suspected it would not work, but also because he lacked the courage. He needed to know what she wanted from the logbooks before deciding on his strategy. This would at least keep his options open. Was it to blackmail him into leaving? Was it simple curiosity to know what he did up in the tree houses? And did she now plan to use the material she had stumbled on as ammunition against her enemies in the village? The theft of the logbooks was not simply an invasion of his privacy. They were not confessional diaries. It was bigger than that. The private lives of the whole village were in those volumes and stood to be compromised. Hallam felt guilty of professional negligence. It was an adult sensation that he did not savor. As a result of Julius's elaborated no comment, the Argos was able to run a story of villagers reacting in fury to plans by a defiant local squire to flatten a historic medieval site to build an ugly New Age housing estate on top of it, or rather underneath it. No to Hobbitland was the headline. The villager quoted was Mr. Hitchens, determined to protect the village beauty spot from developers prepared to flatten our heritage for a trouserful of cash. Julius let the newspaper drop. What about the ugly little estates they live in? And what the H is it to do with them? And since when do they have any of them give a toss about the precious heritage of an overgrown swamp? All I've ever gotten is complaints from that bloody farmer. But how did the paper get to hear about it? Asked Verity. How do I know? Could it have been someone in this planning office? It can't have been them, because the plan wasn't submitted until late afternoon. They wouldn't have even looked at it until the next day. Who else knew? The surveyors, I suppose, but I can't believe they would do it. There's no reason. I've worked with them for years. The tree surgeon? All he knew is that a dangerous tree needed to be cut down. The office? I have complete trust in Nicola and the rest of the team. Then who's left? Carl? I may have mentioned something, but I can't believe it. Verity smiled at Hallam, who looked sullenly black. Well, that only leaves family. Hallam, did you speak to the journalist or anyone else about this? I wish I'd thought of it, said Hallam. Get out of my sight, said Julius. Hallam walked out of the kitchen. He had a pretty good idea who Lucy must have used her new mobile phone to call. Julius must have told her about the Lakeland plans. But whoever was responsible, Hallam already suspected he was going to pay for it in one way or another. In the early evening, Verity called for Hallam from the top of the broad stone steps at the front of the hall. Julius was with her. Hallam had already seen them, of course. He could almost read their lips from the southwest traverse with his new binoculars. She and Julius descended the steps and strolled down the path arm in arm. She had a large handbag slung over her shoulder. The couple were admiring the full frontal view of the property from the bench in front of the ornamental pond by the time Hallam hit the ground.